Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this presentation on the explosive and the aggressive behavior in elementary. I did present this morning for the secondary version. This afternoon, we're doing the elementary version. Similar in some ways, but at the same time, of course, our clientele, given the immaturity of our younger population, is different. And so the way that we'll be dividing the presentation today is I will start a first section on just making sense of aggression in the first place and the root of it. And so for some of you that may have heard me speak before on this theme, this will be a kind of a repeat, but at the same time, confirmation of certain things that you're already doing. And a lot of this material is based from the Neufeld Institute material, not just from Gordon Neufeld, but mainly. So in terms of aggression, oftentimes we are caught up with the symptoms of aggression in terms of the student potentially being sarcastic or being aggressive, irritable, having tantrums, fighting, hostility, and so forth. And oftentimes many of the other types of lenses, especially the behavioral lens, will focus on the symptoms of these different behaviors and will try to address it at the symptom level. Whereas the developmental approach looks at it from a different angle. The analogy of the iceberg is a perfect one because rather than looking at what we see, it's about making sense what is happening at the base, what is happening at the root. And so the root of aggression is actually frustration. Frustration is a very primitive emotion. We all have the emotion of frustration. And it's an emotion that is meant to push us into action. Oftentimes this emotion will come up when we're trying to do something and it's not working, or that we have an expectation and that the expectation hasn't been met, and so forth. And so this will cause frustration. Now, just to illustrate, and before I get to the illustration, the way that our system works is that once the brain has activated in the limbic system, the emotion will kick off. All of the physiological, biological chemistry of the body will follow suit. And so in terms of the sympathetic nervous system, you will have the adrenaline that will kick in, the cortisol, the heart rate will raise, and so forth. And so this is not something that we decide to do. It's something that happens to us. And if we're able to be conscious of it, we will have the words like, oh my goodness, I'm so frustrated, or this is not working for me, or I'm not happy with this situation right now. And so this is what we're talking about when we're talking of frustration. Now, our kids live way too much frustration in a day, in a week, in their lifetime. And the younger they are, the more frustration they have because they're still not old enough to be able to do everything that they would like to do to the degree that they would like to do it. And they also get a lot of futilities in life, meaning having certain boundaries, having limits, the adults saying no to things, they don't have the same freedom, and so forth. And it's to be expected. It's part of life. It's part of growing up, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't frustrate. And so to think about our little ones, from the moment that they wake up in the morning, that they are groggy, maybe they've had a bad night, had nightmares, didn't sleep well, and the way that we wake up with an alarm or somebody that wakes us up, it's really not a natural way of waking up. And so that in itself can be quite frustrating. Sometimes, parents have too much on their plate and doing way too many things at once. And so rushing in the morning to get everything ready. Oh my goodness, grabbing the school bus and so forth. What if we miss the bus? And so there's a lot of stress, especially in the organization of the morning. Then add on, if the child has chores or that they don't like to do homework, sibling interaction or peer interaction can be very frustrating. When the adults say no and really mean a no and don't budge, that can be truly frustrating. Not being able to win all the time, not getting your way all the time, not being the best at everything. The last ones are examples of typical what we call life futilities. For those who have read the book Rest, Play, Grow from Deborah McNamara, Deborah, in her chapter on frustration, I think it was called Tears and Tantrum, she talks about all of the life futilities. And we're meant, all of us, to go through that at some point in our lives. And until we resolve them, these are things that continue to follow us all the way to adulthood. Like how often we can have adults for whom some of these life utilities have not been resolved for them, about not being perfect at everything or not being able to win all the time, and so forth. That you're, for example, I'm thinking of another one for younger. If your parents have had a new baby and adapting to the fact that now you've got to share mom and dad with a sibling, and how frustrating that can be as well. Now, before I go any further into frustration, I wanted to take a second to really distinguish between anger and frustration, because even in the literature, they interchange the two words and use them synonymously. But the truth of the matter is that they're actually not at all the same concept. And so the difference between the two is that anger is actually an emotion that is experienced only by humans, whereas frustration is an emotional experience that is done by many other species, not just humans. And so I could even think for those who have pets at home, you can see with your pet, if they're trying to get a toy and can't access it, the frustration that they may have with that. And so this is more of a universal emotion, a more primitive emotion as well. Anger is evoked by perceived injustice, whereas frustration is evoked by something that is not working for us. Anger involves these more sophisticated parts of our brain. It requires cerebral cortex, and for us to be aware, to be conscious of that, we don't deliberately do anger. Anger is something that we do very consciously, whereas frustration can actually exist in our system without us even feeling it. How often we see children, especially young, immature, impulsive children, that will hit and that they won't recognize or realize that they've done it until they see the repercussions of their actions. And so it comes from a more primitive part of the body. And many times, if you think about the flight, fight, freeze response from the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, this is what we're talking about. So the fight response is the frustration. And so in terms of the anger, it's oftentimes triggers the impulses to seek justice. And so we're there to try to get even, to seek revenge, to seek for an apology and so forth. Whereas frustration, that triggers the impulse to attack. And the word attack is actually a very wide term. It can mean many different things. We can attack verbally, we can attack physically, we can attack outwards, we can even attack inwards towards ourselves. How often a child will say, "I'm stupid." So that is a form of verbal self-attack. And so just to show you the degree to which there's a range in terms of the attack. Oftentimes when we're thinking attack, we're thinking about the kid who will punch or kick, but it is much wider than that. When an adult is being sarcastic, sarcasm is actually a form of more subtle, civilized attack. And so the other piece I think it is important for me to note is that not all aggression is by default violent. It's not necessarily violence. And so it can be violating to the person who's receiving the attack, but the intent behind aggression oftentimes is just an overload in the brain and the body, and that the energy is released. And sometimes it can be aimed at something or someone, but it is not meant in its intention to be violent. And so I really wanted to distinguish that, because when it comes to the anti-violence, anti-bullying plan, the ABAV plan that you have in your schools and at your school board, we have a hard time distinguishing between what is an act that is aggressive, that is considered violent, versus not in the sense of, yes, it's hurtful or harmful, but it doesn't mean that it's violent. So I really wanted to make that distinction. The other thing that I wanted to name is that there really is a continuum in terms of aggression, where on the one hand, on the most kind of less defended level of attack and aggression, we may have the impulse to attack, but we don't necessarily act upon it. Think about many of us as adults, if we are well-tempered, if we're mature enough and we're able to temper our frustration, we may still have aggressive thoughts. We may have, what's the word? There's a term for this. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting it now. It's the afternoon, but we may have these visions, these very vivid visions of us wanting to hurt somebody because we're so frustrated with them, but it doesn't mean that we actually act on it. And I really wanted to separate the impulse to attack versus the actual attack. Because many of us oftentimes have these impulses and they're are normal and natural, and when we shouldn't be embarrassed or shameful about having those impulses. We're meant to have those impulses. And so it's not about addressing the impulse. It is about trying to find a way to soften, and I'll get to that soon, but to be able to soften the child where they're able to either release preventatively some of that energy, or that they're able to find their perspective and their mixed feelings, and to find their patience to not act on the impulse. So if we continue on the continuum, then the second level of that is eruption of the attacking energy. So even if we had the impulse, we actually it got away on us, and the attack came. I just realized that I didn't share the slides with everybody. I don't know if I can do this like this. I'm going to try.
I did. I
Oh, you
already did,
did?
Catherine.
Oh,
Yes, I
thank you,
did.
Emmanuel. You see, I'm distracted this afternoon, so my apologies for that. So I'm glad people got the slides. And so in the middle section, so where you've got the eruption, and then on the full extreme of it, when a child is fully defended, and not only are they not feeling their frustration, but now it is more than just an impulse. It has become an aggression problem, where that aggression is quite violating towards others. And so we can see the continuum. And by the way, before I forget, not all children have the same bent in terms of emotions. Two children can have the exact same trigger, but they will have a different way to go about that trigger, where one could go more towards being alarmed by a situation and moving more to avoidance or anxiety related problems. And then you can have another child who's in the same circumstances, but for different reasons will fall more into the frustration, aggression realm. And so it's not that one child is better than the other. We're just each unique in that way, where some people have the bent more towards aggression and others more towards other types of emotions. But they all more or less work the same in terms of our limbic system and the way that emotions run. Now, I'm going to use the analogy of the traffic circle. This is Gordon Neufeld's analogy. These are his slides. And so for those who have taken the course, Making Sense of Aggression, you have seen this traffic circle before. And so I'm going to walk it through for those who haven't seen it before. And so the idea here behind this imagery is that there isn't any aggression without frustration. The first step in is that there is indeed frustration to be had. And so if there is an element that triggers the child, and that frustration is what results from that situation, then frustration will come down the pike. And the first thing that, and again, each child is different. Some will go very quickly to attack. I forgot to mention this with the high school crowd, but some will go very quickly from frustration to attack. Others will actually try first to affect change. And so think about, yourself as a parent, or even with your students, when you've got a child who is whining and that is not having it and trying to convince you and trying to change your mind, and they're going back and forth. This is the change energy, where they're trying to get what it is that they want, or that they're trying to move away from the thing they don't want, and will nag and try to find different ways as they're frustrated, and will become more increasingly nagging in order to effect change. Now, if for different reasons it is not possible to effect change, because in terms of the reality of every day, or because the adult has put forward a boundary, a limit, has said no, then unless they continue to try to convince you and they're stuck here, what we want is for eventually this child to accept the fact that a no is a no. So to give the example of the child who wants a cookie before dinner, and that the parent says no to the cookie, Maybe the child will promise that they'll eat all their food after they've had the cookie. They're only going to have one cookie, and they promise they won't have another one. That they won't have dessert if they have the cookie. Like so many different ways they could go about trying to convince the parent and to affect change. But if the parent says no, I have said no, and I'm not going to change my mind, then from that futility can result two different things. Either the child will have sadness and disappointment with the fact that they're not having it and are wanting to have it. Sometimes kids will pout. And so pouting is a proof of the fact that the child's understood the boundary, has understood the limit. And sometimes adults are actually very reactive when kids will pout, or when kids will whine and will nag. And so just for us to understand the root of these different behaviors and to be able to explain them better. And so if the child is soft enough and vulnerable enough, then disappointment and sadness will come, where the child will be disappointed that they couldn't have the cookie. If we're thinking about a younger child, they may be moved to tears because, oh my goodness, is it the end of the world that they couldn't have the cookie in the moment, and so forth. And so we call this adaptation, when there is an acceptation about the fact that we have no power in effecting change. We're accepting the fact that there's a limit and that there is nothing that we can do. Now, if you have a child who is not vulnerable, who doesn't allow themselves to be vulnerable because it is too much to bear, and that they tend to be more defended, adaptation will be very difficult for that type of child. And so sometimes what will happen is that they will bypass the outlet of adaptation and move directly to attack. Now, I really want to make it clear to everybody that adaptation is not necessarily the best and only outlet where we want to bring our children. If we could try to limit their frustrations, more power to you. If we can affect change and it is all right and it's possible, why not do it? If the child is in that space to be receptive to their deception and their sadness, then of course opening the door to the tears would be the way to go. But many children have a hard time with tears, feel very uncomfortable with tears, and will not allow themselves to be vulnerable. I know for me, I've got a 14-year-old at home, and when my daughter was 5, she was the type, because she was so sensitive and over the top, that she wouldn't move to sadness right away. She first needed to let out a little bit of attack because it was just too much. She was so intense and sensitive that she needed to let out a little bit of attack first, whether it was screaming or hitting something, throwing something, whatever it was. And then once she had let out a bit of it, then she was in a place where she did a second round in the circle, in the traffic circle, and then she would find her tears. And so I got to discover that with my daughter, there was no way that I could push her beyond her capacity, her readiness to find her tears if she wasn't there yet. If she was still feeling her frustration, and her frustration was very foul, then I knew that attack was coming. And so when we anticipate it, when we know that it's coming, we interact with it so differently than when it takes us by surprise. And so I really want for you to understand that this is not something we choose. We don't choose the outlet. The outlet happens to us depending on the circumstances. And so when you have a child who attacks, rather than trying to address the attack and I'm not saying that we shouldn't address the attack, but for it, at least on the first forefront, to give us the cue that if the child is attacking, it means that they're really frustrated about something. And what is it that they're frustrated about? Like, how often we have students that get frustrated time and time again with the same situations over and over and over again. And so rather than waiting for the same situation to happen in the exact same way, how can we affect change to be able to limit some of that attack or some of that frustration for the student? And so you'll see as we get further into the slides that we can accompany the student to release that attack. And I'm not saying that we should be doing this, in the classroom in front of everybody in the middle of a lesson plan. Of course, there's a time and place for these things. Can we find pockets of time and space in the building where students can have, especially preventatively, because we know with all of the frustrations that they have day in, day out, could we try to help and empty their bucket a little bit, empty their glass so it's not so full and it overflows? I mentioned some examples on a daily basis of their frustrations, but we know that there's some of our students that have more frustrating lives than others. And so many examples here from, parents that are separated, where there's highly, conflictual dynamics, where a child might be placed in foster care or removed from their family, where there's hospitalization happening, where the parents are often traveling or busy working, really not giving, the time and the attention that the child needs. If there's a parent or a family member in prison or other life circumstances, thinking about trauma and so forth, that all of these can have an extra layer of frustration. I will be presenting tomorrow on neurodiversity. And so again, thinking about our neurodiverse population, the world is frustrating to them because it is so overwhelming, the noise, the movement, and all of that. And so for them, that's an extra layer of frustration. And so I invite you to take the time, especially with those students that you work with that are highly explosive and aggressive, to make a short list of all of the different types of frustration that they live in a day. And once they get to school, how many hours are they in the bus? How about peer interaction in the schoolyard? How about the setup in the classroom? Is it adapted to their needs? The learning situation, is it frustrating to them, and so forth? And so thinking about all of these different examples that add on to the frustration. So I showed you before, I'll just go back to that image so you can see it, that when we are in touch, when the body and the mind are connected and that we're attuned to our body, we're able to have what we call a feeling of our emotions. And so emotions is the raw physiological reaction from the body, where we can give it names like happiness and sadness and anger, frustration, and so forth. But the feeling is to be able to recognize that this is what's happening inside your body. So when we've got students that live a lot of frustrations in their day-to-day and that have a lot of defenses, what will happen is that the defenses will prevent us from feeling those emotions. So it's not that we don't have the emotion, we have the emotion, but we're not able to recognize it. There's a disconnect between the body and the mind. And so the body will move into flight, fight, freeze response. And if they're in fight response, then they will have all of the behavior that comes with it, whether it's to be abrupt, to be impatient, to be rude, irritable, physical, having tantrums, and so forth. And these are just some examples of symptoms of aggression. And so these are not things that the student chooses to do. These are things that happen to them. And even more so when there's a disconnect between the body and the mind and they're not able to feel their emotions. In order for a child to be able to name what they're feeling, they need to be able to recognize that they're feeling it. And so the words will only come if you've got it, or the connection will only come if you've got the feeling. So what happens on a chemistry level is that when the amygdala gets kicked off because of the frustration, the amygdala will send a signal to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus will orchestrate through the endocrine system, the sympathetic nervous system. And that's what we call the fight, flight, freeze response. And so once that's activated, it needs to finish its loop before the parasympathetic comes in place and helps for us to calm down. Now, we tend to, in the more behavioral type of approach, to, like I said, to focus on the symptoms of the behavior and to try to find at all cost a way to contain it and shut it down. We are recognizing now more and more with literature and research and so forth that there's actually very dangerous repercussions of cutting out and shutting down emotions before they have finished their loop. And so we know now in terms of mental health problems and so forth, even in the literature for adults. I read a book over a year ago on burnout for adults. And part of what the author was saying in that book is that if adults don't give themselves the permission to finish the loop of their emotions and that emotions remain unresolved and accumulate themselves, then this will lead to burnout and depression. And so in order to prevent that from happening, it is about allowing our emotions to run their course. Emotions have a purpose, and so to let them do what the job that they need to do. And frustration, by the way, is a very valuable emotion, in the sense that if we were never frustrated, then frustration wouldn't give us the opportunity to be perseverant, to have determination, to plow through in front of adversity and so forth. And so there is a purpose to this emotion. The issue is not frustration in itself. The issue is when impulses get away on us. And so how can we help our children and students to find healthy, safe ways to release that pent-up frustration without it becoming an impulse to attack that creates havoc? So when we understand the true nature of emotions, we understand, like I mentioned, that emotions are happening to us as opposed to being under our choice or under our control. And so achieving emotional health and maturity relies on the fact that we're allowing for emotions to express themselves and finish their loop. And also, in order for us to feel those emotions, and only once some of these things are happening, can we eventually talk about self-regulation. And until that, we need to focus on what we call co-regulation. And I'll get to that in a minute. But before I get back to that, I just wanted to mention to you that even if we are able to find our patience, and that our patience allows for the tempering of the impulse to attack, and that we don't attack, it doesn't mean that we are less frustrated. Think about yourself, for those who have in your household, where you're trying to organize things every day, and let's say between your partner and your kids, and that you're trying to organize certain things, and that all sorts of stuff get in the way, and you might at first try to be very creative and to try to find solutions to that situation, but at some point it takes a toll on the system. And so we can be the most civilized, tempered person, but if we keep on cycling in the loop over and over and over again, at some point we are going to be surprised by the impulse that will let out on us. How often it will happen for adults where we raise our voice, and sometimes we're even surprised to what degree we've raised our voice. And so the raising of the voice is actually yet another example of the impulse to attack, where we've done it through the verbal, we've done it through the voice, but it is a form of attack. And so what we need to do to help our students and children grow in terms of their impulses to attack is not to make them feel embarrassed or shameful about those impulses. It is about helping them to have perspective that even though you are inclined to attack, your inclination to care and to attach is just as important and helps to neutralize the inclination to attack. If we have an impulse that drives us to attack, but that we are concerned about the consequences, and again, I am not saying that if we give a consequence that this will help to temper the impulse. The child needs to care about the consequence. So it's not what we do, it's how they see it and how they care about it. So if the child cares about the potential consequences, this will help neutralize the impulse to attack. The non-violent intentions temper the violent urges. The want to not harm is what will temper the impulse to hurt. And this is what we call patience. So for example, if you want to strike or bite, it's the keeping close that will help temper it. To insult and to criticize is to want to take care of that person, and that will help temper it. To have the impulse to put somebody down, to care for them, is what will help for us not to do it. To hurt or to wound is to protect from hurting the other person. To yell at that person, and these are just some examples, and I won't go through all of them, but please understand that patience is not having the impulse to attack. If you feel that you don't have a right to have that impulse, then you forget the whole left side of this slide, and then the right side, of the slide, and you have nothing to temper if you don't allow for the impulse to exist. And so it's about bringing them side by side. The same thing with civility. And so civility is that you might have the impulse to strike or to bite, but that you are afraid of getting into trouble. And so because you care about the fact that you don't want to be in trouble, this will be enough to temper this impulse to attack, where you may be worried about getting hurt, or about alienating the other, or about disappointing the ones that you care about, and so forth. And so these are all different examples to help temper the impulse to attack. And this is what we call being civil. Now, I mentioned before that co-regulation is necessary with our very immature, impulsive children and students that we're working with. And the reason why co-regulation is necessary is because self-regulation, which is the fourth step here, cannot happen until we first allow ourselves to unfold the other steps within the development of emotional health and well-being. And so the way in is not for us to push students and children to reflect and self-regulate. And a lot of our programs are based on this, trying to get kids to reflect, trying to get kids to use their tools to regulate. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't plant the seed, but what I'm saying is that if our expectation is to start from the backhand without even having worked the forefront of it, then we're going about it backwards. And so the idea here is that we actually give space and time for children to have moments where they can express those emotions, whether when they are upset or even preventatively through a game or through play, that we can give them moments where they are able to express. And the second level is for us to teach the words. But it is more than just giving the words. It's to help them make the connection between what it is that they're feeling in their bodies and what that phenomenon or that experience, what is that called? Because so many times children will have all the words. They will say sad, mad, happy, and all of that, but they have a hard time connecting those words to what is happening to them internally. And so it is important for us as adults to not just introduce these terms, but to also have the exchange and the modeling about what is it like for us, the adults who have gone through this. What does frustration mean to us? What does sadness mean to us? What is happiness and so forth, and all of these different types of emotions, to be able to not just give it a name, but also to be able to discuss the actual experience. What does it feel like in our bodies? What does it feel like? What thoughts come to our mind and so forth. So to be able to unfold that and to elaborate it further using stories. There's so many amazing books out there for elementary on frustration, on sadness, on fears, and so forth. And so using characters and their stories to be able to illustrate that experience. And so only once they have experience of expressing, that they're able to do the connection between their body and their minds and have the words, that they are vulnerable enough to feel their emotions, only then can they regulate. Regulation is basically this here, that you're able to bring the two side by side, and you cannot do that if you're not feeling your emotions and if you don't have the words for it, and that you haven't had enough experiences of expression to know what it feels like in your body. And so once we've built all of this, then in a good, safe context, we can accompany students to reflect on those emotions, but done in a way that is very curious. It's not about judging. It's not about good or bad emotions. All emotions have a purpose and a reason for existing. And so it's for making room for those different emotions. When we focus on consequences as a way to control the behavior, or a behavior management system in order to control the behavior, not only are we increasing their frustration. Think about those for whom, the idea of the green, yellow, red, and that find themselves in the red more often than not. It doesn't help them to teach them to behave more properly. It just makes them more frustrated that they're not able, like the other peers in their classroom, to be in the green. And so I'm just gonna take a sip of water. So I'm not saying that there shouldn't be natural consequences in life. I'm not saying that there aren't times where suspension or suspension is not needed and necessary. But what I'm saying is that a child who is suspended at home, just like a child who is punished in their room when a parent has sent them to their room to think, the last thing they're doing is thinking. Oftentimes they are in a place where they're feeling rejected, they're feeling like they're not understood, where this is more frustrating for them and so forth. And so these are not methods that help children gain capacity to temper their impulses. And so again, depending on the child, there may be some kids who are so afraid of getting in trouble that they will act in the way that they think that the adults want them to act, but it's not because it's been integrated, it's because they're afraid. And so those kids that find themselves time and time again in trouble is because they are so impulsive and that they have a hard time, even though they have the right answers. I mean, you could sit with them one-to-one and ask them why they did what they did and what they could have done differently. And when they're calm, they'll give you all the right answers. And the issue is not that they don't have the answers, is that in the moment when the brain is hijacked by the emotion of frustration, there isn't enough energy and perspective in the brain to be able to say, no, I know you're frustrated, but you're not going to act in frustration. You are going to be civil. They just can't in that moment. And especially, those kids who are hypersensitive, those that are autistic, those who have history of trauma. Trauma is a huge piece that will mess around with the way that the limbic system functions. The amygdala for a child who has gone through trauma is much more sensitive and easily decalibrated. And so it will react more often and more intensely than an individual who has not gone through trauma. And so many of these kids are disadvantaged. Those that are neurodiverse and don't have the same life conditions are disadvantaged compared to their peers who are neurotypical and who have the right conditions to be able to be vulnerable and to feel their emotions. So the danger here is that if their immaturity or defendedness turns into alienating behavior, if we're focused just on the behavior and that we address it in a very authoritarian type of way, then this will just keep the child stuck in their defendedness and add more emotion, and it will continue the vicious circle. And the thing with emotion is that you cannot suppress them forever. And so a child may temporarily be able to suppress frustration and aggression because they're afraid of the consequences. But trust me, the cycle will find a way out. And what will happen eventually is that if it becomes cumulative, it will just become more and more explosive. And so we want to be careful that we don't accumulate their system and that they don't have an outlet. We need to do the exact opposite. How can we help minimize the bucket? And how can we give them as many outlets as possible, as often as possible, for them to be able to not have it accumulated where it will become explosive? And so rather than talking about what's wrong with the child and that the behavior has to stop, really shifting that lens to, oh my goodness, is the student experiencing so much frustration right now? There are so many things, and I can name them, that is not working in their life. And so my job is not to get the behavior to stop. It is, what can I do to help to release and reduce the frustration in their system? Now, before I get to that part, I just wanted to mention that in order for behavior to change, behavior doesn't change on its own, especially not simply because of consequences or because of rewards. It could shift temporarily, but it's not a true change. And so behavior will truly change only when maturation has taken its course, when nature has done what it needs to do, and that the child has developed their prefrontal cortex fully, and that it is all engaged. Then at that point, they will have more capacity to self-regulate, given the capacity from the prefrontal cortex. I mentioned before that it is important for us to feel our emotions, because without feeling them, we cannot temper them. And so behavior will only change when we are in touch enough with our emotions and that we're feeling them in order to change. also, so hand in hand goes with the vulnerability. And so if the child is allowing themselves, given the right conditions, that they're feeling safe and protected, that they will be softened and in touch with their emotions, only then in turn will behavior change. And ultimately, all of this requires a good attachment. And so in the good attachment, if we start with co-regulation and that we're there as an emotional coach and helping for them to be successful and protecting them from getting into trouble, then all of this together will help effect change in terms of behavior. So your job as an adult is actually multifold. And you can work at the traffic circle on any side. And by the way, on this picture, I added an extra outlet just to illustrate the point that I wanted to make. So on the first top part, are there things that we can help reduce in terms of their daily frustrations? If we know, that the child going to recess in an unstructured activity is something that is going to be more frustrating than helpful and will create more issues, then maybe we need to set up for that student pockets of time where they're doing something more structured during recess. It could be an indoor recess with a peer, and they're doing a more structured game under supervision from the adult. And again, of course, they need to go outside. It's not about stopping them from going outdoors, but trying to find pockets of things to help them to minimize the frustration. How many of our students need to move? Needing flexible seating, needing to have alternate workstations where they're standing up during certain activities because their body has this need, and that if we're not fulfilling that need, then it's just accumulated stress in the body. And so being able to put in place different things to minimize the input of frustration on the first end. On the second end, can we look at, if we can, and it is possible for us to help effect change if needed, but at the same time, if it's not possible, being that nurturing agent of futility. And so if we're saying no, that we're saying no in a way that is patient, and that we understand that the child may react to our no, especially an impulsive, immature child will most probably 9 times out of 10 react to our no. And so rather than putting up the limit and being no, and then being angry that the child reacted, that we anticipate that they will indeed react and see it like a natural kind of fallout of the limit that we've put in place. And so on the one hand, we're there to help them to experience those boundaries, those limits in life. And those limits are needed, because without that, then we become adults that have never resolved these life futilities. On this end here, can we be that comforter for the student to be able to help in terms of their sadness or their disappointment, and to be there for them, either if they want to share or they just want that warm presence or whatever it is, that we are there to help them through the adaptation if that's where they're at. If that's not where they're at, can we help them preventatively? So that's a difference between the two outlets here, is that here we are doing it in a preventative mode. We're not waiting for the child to be upset to have them express. So we schedule in their day pockets of time and spaces where they can go and let out whatever energy they have in their system. So we're doing this preventatively, and we could be using play as the medium. Whereas here, the child is already acting out and we're just there to accompany them. I know that some of your schools have a nurturing support center and have an emotions room. And so an emotions room could be used for both purposes, both in prevention and in intervention. And maybe to try in our conversation after the fact, once they're calm and that we're debriefing, that maybe we're there to help them find their integrative functioning, to be able to find their patience, find their need for civility and so forth, by helping them compare the two sides of the mixing of the two. So if we move over to practices, because it's great to talk about theory and to make sense of frustration and aggression, but I'm sure many of you are here to find out, so what do we do with this? And so the CBM pyramid of intervention has been put in place with frustration and aggression in mind as well. I mean, not just for frustration and aggression, but it's definitely part of it. And so what are those universal best practices for all that are put in place for students to be successful? What are the additional targeted practices for some students that need more than just the universal? And what are the intensive and individualized measures to help those few students for whom the universal and the targeted are not sufficient? So for tier 1, we're mostly focusing on prevention and setting up a sense of safety for the students, creating an environment where students can feel safe enough, one, to express, but two, to feel the vulnerability of their emotions and not bring up their defenses, compensating for the students' needs and challenges by setting the right conditions for them to be successful. At the targeted level, trying to support the student more targetedly, and collaborating with other adults and collaborating with the child. And so acting as a co-regulator and communicating with all of the adults involved to make sure that we're all in the know about what are those potential triggers, being careful about the approach that we use and so forth to not trigger the child further. And in tier 3, oftentimes we are caught up with those more explosive cases in crisis intervention or in de-escalation. And instead of always putting out fires, to be able to be more preventative in the tier 3, trying to put together as a team a plan in place, thinking about, what would be plan A and plan B if plan A can't work and so forth. I'm thinking about scheduling certain tools or resources and providing certain tools. All of that would be part of the tier 3. Needing to take a step back to diffuse the situation and avoiding to trigger the student further. So in terms of the tier 1, what we're looking at is in terms of the environment, but also the relationship. Does the teacher take the time to build a rapport with each of the students, getting to know the students' names, getting to know their interests, their likes? It's more than just a student-teacher relationship. Children don't work through roles. Children work through relationship. It's who you are to them that matters. Not the fact that you're the teacher, but that you're their teacher and that they care about you and they feel that you care about them. And I'm saying teacher, but please understand me, the same thing with support staff. And so having the adults being careful about not breaking the relationship when there is aggression. And it's hard to do that, like when we're getting attacked by a student, in order for us to establish safety and to make sure that, everything's going all right, sometimes things get out of hand. Sometimes, emotions run high. And so to be able to not take it personal to the best of our capacity, I mean, we are humans and we do have our own traffic circle, but to be able to, after the storm has passed, to repair if need be, to reassure the student that didn't break the relationship, that our relationship is not conditional solely to their good behavior, that we want to be with them and work with them, and that we have enjoyment in their presence. These things are so important in terms of building that environment of safety. Coming alongside the student's emotion, even if for us it feels so ridiculous or irrational, unreasonable. Remember what it was like when we were their age. How every first thing that they live is the end of the world to them because they've never lived it before. Like I was thinking the other day of that 2-year-old who tips over his glass of milk and who starts to cry so intensely because of the disappointment that the milk knocked over. And so for us, it's so silly, right? I mean, we could knock over things anytime, all the time. But for them, it is a big deal. And so to put ourselves in their shoes, and to, rather than trying to tug and pull where we want them to be, is for us to start where they're at. And so continuing in terms of the safe environment, to anticipate the potential problematic situations and taking charge, by compensating for the child. So if you know that Johnny can't go to the bathroom by themselves without supervision because they are going to wander in the school and start, causing problems, or they'll go to the bathroom and they'll start throwing toilet paper everywhere, that we try to put in place certain measures to make sure that we're there to structure and that things are predictable as well. Predictability is so key with our immature population, because what they don't know what is coming up and they're feeling angst about anticipating what may be actually triggers further in terms of frustration. And so to be able to limit that and for things to be much more predictable, having visual schedules, being able to put different tags on different things so they know what's what and what's where, making things much more in terms of structure and routine and so forth. Offering a variety of different options. Not all students work well with the same tools. And so it's about adapting the tool for the specific child. Some students will do well with high-level energy activities where you're there and you're spending out all the energy and you're doing jumping jacks, and that's really helpful. And for other students, that can be even more dysregulating. And so what can we put in place for different students, having a variety to be more inclusive, to help everybody have an opportunity to feel like this has been beneficial to them. For those who are interested, I've got on the CBM website at this address a document. It's a 6-page document on different examples of activities for the elementary level through play and through games and so forth that you can use to help express emotion, to be able to let it out. So I invite you to go and take a look at that document. I also invite you to go and take a look at the emotional release activities. Hannah Beach, who is the author of Reclaiming Our Students. I know many of you have received copies of that book. So with the book comes along a handbook called the Inside Out Handbook. And also on Hannah's website, she's got a few editorials where she talks about the frustration monster, and she talks about, I think it's a drumming, I can't recall the title of them. One of them is around drumming. The other one is about drawing music and so forth. So to be able to use these different mediums to express emotion. I mentioned stories. And so using characters in different books around different emotions where children can read about the fact that, the little boy in this story, oh my goodness, I can so relate. And I've gone through the same thing, to be able to normalize and to validate what it is that they're going through in a day. And again, when we're talking about helping them to name their emotions, it's not just about the words. It's helping them make the connection between the word and the experience. And this is huge in terms of tier 1. In terms of tier 2, this is where not only is this may not only happen in the classroom, it may also be happening in the hallway. The teacher is still involved, but support staff would be involved as well. And so I invite you to go and take a look at the CBM website underneath, and I'll show you at the end of the presentation. I'll stop sharing my presentation and I'll show you where to go on the website. I have a placemat on examples of what we could be doing in the classroom and in the schoolyard around frustration to help minimize aggression. So I invite you to go and take a look at this document. Some examples of tier 2 tools and measures that can help with frustration could be, for example, the quiet corner. Sometimes students are overly stimulated in the classroom and need a reset or a timeout. And so in order to have a space in the room, and it doesn't really matter, honestly, what it looks like. I've seen a classroom where they took a desk and they Velcroed a piece of fabric on the bottom, and it made kind of like a cocooning place underneath the desk. And so you can really make it, a simple, you don't need to buy something. You could be really making it quite simple. And having tools there available to help in terms of regulating the system. There's some examples here on the slide. I have a whole document that talks about the quiet corner, how to set it up in terms of materials, in terms of considerations and so forth. So I invite you to go and take a look at that document. The other thing that could be a good idea, and again, we're at tier 2 here, so it's not for all kids. It is for some kids that may benefit from this, where we put together an individual bin. And perhaps the bin, they could be using it at their desk, or they could be using it in the quiet corner, or they could be leaving the classroom and using it in an alternative setting in the school, whether a nurturing support center or another space. And in that bin, they will have a variety of different tools in order to help them to manage their emotions, whether it is different fidgets, different, could be journaling for older students, storybooks, it could be cards on emotions, it could be doing origami or doing mandalas, and all sorts of different activities. I would suggest that in the bin, that if the student has an IEP and has certain goals, academic goals, that you could also put into that bin certain worksheets that they can do on their own very autonomously and feel successful at doing in that bin. So it's not just different tools for emotions, but also helpful tools in terms of academics. You could even be putting all of the IEP accommodation pieces, whatever it is that they need in evaluations and such, in the bin. In terms of movement, some students need high energy movement, some need more recentering, like yoga or stretches. And so you could easily have, if you have a big enough classroom, have a corner there that doesn't bother. So you could see here, there's furniture that's hiding and there's a plant. So other kids don't get distracted by the student who goes to the corner, and to be able to take a reset break. And by the way, this is above and beyond the brain breaks. So you would be doing brain breaks with the kids, but then for those who need more, they could be going either in the corner or that this could be happening in the hallway. If the student is too frustrated and cannot maintain in the classroom, rather than saying, I'm sending you out, or I'm sending you to the principal's office, or I'm sending you to the NSC, that we do this in a more subtle way, where we send the student on an errand with an envelope. And this is called You've Got Mail. And in the envelope is an activity that the student can do. So this is something that needs to be set up ahead of time. You need to have a designated adult. They need to be aware of what's the process and so forth. But this could be a perfect way to get a student where we're preserving their dignity to leave the classroom because they can't manage. But at the same time, they are feeling they're feeling successful in the sense that we haven't been too direct or negative in terms of their behavior. We're really just addressing right now the circumstances, not the behavior. In terms of tier 3, looking at more intensified, more individualized supports. Support staff is very involved in tier 3. Tier 3 students are meant to be approached as a team, where it's not supposed to be the responsibility of one adult. The responsibility is shared between different players that are involved with that student. Being able to set up check-ins, being able to have pockets of moments where they take breaks and so forth, and to be able to share the weight and keeping communication so clear and open between all of the players, including the parents. In terms of, I mentioned check-ins, and so for those students that have a hard time managing, to have that connection with one adult with whom they feel safe, where the adult is there to kind of let them vent or to walk through a situation or whatever that is, can be so beneficial to have that available in a day for a student. And again, I've got available on the website documentation. I've got a video capsule explaining how to do the check-ins and so forth. So I invite you to go and take a look at that. And so just making the distinction, and I already spoke about this, between giving a timeout where we're being deliberate and we're being very explicit, versus giving a time away where we know the student has a need and that we're having them go somewhere else, or that they go to the quiet corner in the classroom or whatnot. And so we're still getting the same result in terms of having the student leave the class, but the way that we go about it is completely different and will make a difference in terms of accumulation of frustration. In terms of the nurturing support centers, well, I mentioned that quite a bit of your schools already have one. And so what could happen in this space is for the adult who's running the space to explore what are these different things that are frustrating and what could be some of the tools that could be beneficial for them to help them both in prevention and in intervention. And so the Nurturing Support Center can be a wonderful place for that. And there's different sections in the Nurturing Support Center. One section could be, for example, where there's physical movement that happens. We know for tier 3 students that cannot manage without supervision, we wouldn't send them by themselves in the hallway like we would in a tier 2 student. A tier 3 student would be doing this under supervision in another space. And so this is where having a nurturing support center can be a benefit. Being able to use play, whether, oh, sorry guys, my dog's barking. Guys, give me a second. He's never going to stop. Give me a second. Sorry, everybody. So in terms of having different play activities to help work out some of these impulses, there's so many different tools that we can use, from using puzzles to mazes to different crafts and construction activities, different types of for example, using a bouncing ball against the wall, or throwing a Velcro dot against a target, doing some drumming, doing some kicking and stomping, using bubble wrap in order to stomp on that, play fighting with pool noodles, destroying or demolishing cardboard boxes. There's so many ways that we can go about releasing some of this extra energy in a safe and beneficial manner. And so other things could also be that we use something that is more in terms of expression on paper. There could be some questions around that, but making it just about questions. I think that the child needs to have a time, when they're really frustrated, and using big pieces of paper, and to be able to make big movements with the crayon, and then to be able to talk about it later when they're in a better space. But to be given that outlet can be really beneficial. Fostering that relationship with frustration, normalizing it for them, that we all have frustration, and that we can see that the situation is not working for you, that's not what you had in mind, and so forth, and to have that ongoing dialogue with the student. So we're moving away from trying to cut it out to having more of a coming alongside and coaching them through it and helping them unfold and grow from that. If you have a nurturing support center, you could have in this section an emotions corner, and there's different materials that the CBM Center of Excellence has put together, the emotions folder, the squawk box, and those can be used in order to walk through emotions. Here's a picture of the emotions folder, and so those can be downloaded off the website, and we have a video capsule explaining how to use it and how to assemble it. And so that one is used for younger students for kindergarten and cycle 1. And for older students, cycle 2 and 3, they could use something similar but more sophisticated called the squawk box, where they have a folder that comes with it, and the student could be writing down different thoughts or ideas or whatever it is, that, or they could even be scribbling at first in it if they're really frustrated. And in the box, there are different fidgets, there are different cards of emotions, cards of ideas of what's not working, cards about what could be certain tools that we could be using, and so forth. And so these could be great tools for your student to be using, but not by themselves. This needs to be introduced. This needs to be modeled. They need to practice it with you. And eventually, when it becomes something that they're used to using, especially for the squawk box, an older student, if they're really frustrated, could just come to the nurturing support center, sit down as the adult is busy with another student, and work on this on their own as the adult becomes available. I mentioned the individual bin before. Alongside the individual bin, we could have what we call a personal choice board. And on that choice board could be examples of tools that the child has pre-selected ahead of time that they know are helpful to help them canalize some of that energy. And so having it as a visual really helps, that when the student is frustrated in the moment, talking sometimes can be a problem, especially when they're very frustrated. And so for them to come to the nurturing support center, go walk to their bin and just pull out their personal choice board, all of it is already laid out there visually. In terms of the emotions room, and so the emotions room can be used both preventatively and in intervention. I actually think that we need to use both all the time, because if we wait only when a student is frustrated and aggressive to bring them to the room, eventually they will not want to go to that room, because it's going to feel like as if we are kind of, I don't want to say punishing them, but that we're sending them to that room because they're misbehaving. And so if they go to that room when they're in a good headspace, and that they're able to explore and to discover what it is that works for them, and that the adult tries things with them, and that they develop a sense of comfort in that space, then we know that they're going to want to go when they are frustrated, because they've lived the benefits so many times that they know that we're doing it for their benefit and not as a punishment. Now, the other thing that's really important with the emotions room is not just to send the student there to release and come back. there needs to be a follow-up where there is some sort of debriefing, where we're talking about, different ways, like what are the ways that work better for them, what are the ones that don't work, and that there's an ongoing conversation to be had between the adult and the child about whatever event and the way that they were triggered and what would be helpful for them. So for a tier 3 student, I don't know if I'd mentioned this already, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but in terms of having a plan in place, not doing things randomly, making things very systematic, that we know what are the triggers for that child, where we have a sense of the patterning, what are the days of the week or the times of the day that are more difficult for them, who's the adult to be involved, and when and how and for how long, and if that adult is not available, who's the backup, and so forth. And so important to have a plan in place, again, not for all students, not for some students, but for the few students that need it. Some people will build in a behavioral section into the IEP. And so that could be another way of going about it. We could either have an action plan, or you can have a section within the IEP where you've got goals in terms of helping them with their frustration. Another thing too that contributes so much at the elementary in terms of frustration is recess. Being in that schoolyard, not having a schoolyard that is set up in a way where there's different sections and that there are structured activities happening. That's where the kids get their most into trouble during transitions. And so some students, especially tier 3 students, need to have sometimes a supported recess where there is an adult outside who is organizing a game and that is having the student under their wing, or that they have what we call a sheltered recess, where they will go to the nurturing support center during not all recesses, but some of them, and will play more of a quiet game one-on-one or with a smaller group. It could happen if the student has an adapted schedule that we will put together what we call an extended recess, where the student will go outside before or after the bell. So they're not outside with everybody. These are the kids who need the outdoors, but at the same time can't handle all of the peer interaction. And so to be able to set up pockets of time where they can be outside, and to have the fresh air and so forth, but in a way that is more structured. And the same thing for lunch, recess and lunch. Just in terms of all the CPI or BMS training that you've done, I won't go through all of it in detail, but keeping in mind, how are we on time? Keeping in mind, our verbal and nonverbal, are we getting ourselves into power struggles with students? Are we being alienated in that moment, and that we are acting out of frustration with the student? Are we trying to control them and their behavior rather than trying to affect change in the circumstances, and so forth? And so really kind of to the best of our capacity, because we're human, we have our own traffic circle. Of course, we will get triggered at times, many times, and not that we shouldn't be triggered, but we need to be aware of the fact that we're being triggered. And so on the one hand, having the lens of how we see the student, but also having the mirror where we're picking up where we're at. And so when you're picking up on where you're at, asking yourselves questions like, what is the other person trying to communicate to me? And of course, the student, we're talking about the student here. How am I responding? What am I expressing or conveying through my verbal and nonverbal? How are they responding back to me? So there's really a back and forth. There's a dance happening there where the student could trigger us, but we can very much trigger the student back. And so to be self-aware of these things and mindful of that as we're going back and forth in the dynamic. And so it's kind of like having a 3-prong approach, where on the one hand, we're keeping an eye on the student and understanding that not all students are equal, depending on their age and their developmental maturity, if they're hypersensitive, if they had a history of trauma and so forth, that this will change the reality of how we're going to address the situation, and especially our expectations. In terms of the context, what's the situation at hand in the moment? Is it a crisis intervention situation, or is a child frustrated but not over the top? And so that will make a difference in terms of how you'll intervene. And also, as I mentioned, the third part is us, the adult. And so where are we at in our level of stress? Are we reflective or reactive? How is our nonverbal and verbal coming across to the student? And so when we know that both us and the child are at a place of full distress, it is not the time or place to try to get into the student's space in order to control the situation. And so this is where I would say power of the team, have another adult involved, that present, where if you are triggered, that they would be somebody there to be a backup in case that you need to time out, and have that other person time in. And so giving space, oftentimes when adults get hit by students, especially with the 4 or 5-year-olds, is because we are way too close in their physical proximity. We are in their bubble. The more they're frustrated, the further away physically we should be. We should not be in their personal space, because sometimes, especially when they are dysregulated, being in their bubble feels not just bothersome, it feels threatening. And so we want to move away from provoking them further, focusing on inviting release and de-escalation. And so think about your CPI and BMS training. And so here are a list of different de-escalation techniques. And so I'll just name a few. You can walk through the slide and read them. In terms of being mindful of your verbal and nonverbal cues, in terms of your tone of voice, in terms of the volume of your voice, if you're speaking too much, too fast, in terms of the words you're choosing, they're judgmental, or, and there's so many different ways. And sometimes we don't realize it. We're just, in the action, in the moment, and we don't realize that we're actually triggering the child further. Making limits really simple, giving few options. This is all of your CPI and BMS training. In terms of our body language, being careful where we place our hands. You could just see by the picture, the visual, having an adult that crosses their arms, it shows defendedness on the part of the adult. And so we want for the child to feel safe with us. And so safety is conveyed not just by our actions, but by our verbal and nonverbal. In terms of the words that we choose, being careful that, rather than saying things that are too direct or that can be provocative, that when we get to the same point, but we come at it from behind, where we may say something like, "It sounds like you need for me to give you space right now," or "I see it didn't turn out the way that you had hoped. How about we take a pause? I'm going to do ... so that this will be easier for you." And so we're really trying to come alongside. And of course, I'm not even talking about restraints and isolation at all at this point. Being mindful of what's available, especially if the child is completely dysregulated and we're moving towards a situation that might be a safety issue, that we focus on the non-restrictive interventions, removing the items that might be dangerous. If there's scissors lying around, taking those scissors away, and so forth. Removing the audience. Focusing on setting limits, but like I said, being very brief, concise, and giving few choices. Having another adult present, and if they're not present, that we call for backup. And that is so, so, so important, because things can switch in a split second with an impulsive, explosive child. And so if we get to a place where scissors are available, and that the child was really frustrated and wouldn't have used scissors otherwise, but they were just there and they took them, now we've moved from a situation where there wasn't danger to a dangerous situation. In terms of restraints and isolation, your school board has a guide that is there to accompany. I'm sure Emmanuel will put it into the chat. The Ministry of Education is working right now on their own guide to be able to accompany schools and boards, and that is to come soon. But I invite you, if you haven't seen that document, please take a look at it. There are 2 different forms that exist in that document, one form for incident reports and one form for debriefing as a team. And so you need to be familiar with these documents, and also to be familiar with any other document talking about the anti-bullying and anti-violence plans, in terms of safety plans, in terms of other regulations, rules and regulations in your school or board, just to be in the know of what's out there for your board. So I mentioned before the importance of debriefing. And of course, debriefing has to be in perfect timing. So we're not debriefing when the child is still frustrated. We're waiting that they've calmed down and that we're able to revisit the situation and kind of see where things are at. And also keeping in mind that some students need a lot more time to detach themselves from the incident. Some students can't debrief the same day. They need to have, it could be later, like let's say it happened in the morning, it could be at the end of the day or the next day. There isn't a restriction in terms of time. You could address something that happened a week or two ago and it would be just as fine. It doesn't, if we haven't addressed it, it doesn't mean that we've given it permission. Kids know when especially in the way that we address it, they know that we are not approving of it. And so if we haven't debriefed, it doesn't mean that we are approving. So I mentioned already the different documentation. And the other piece too is in terms of the IEP. So if you're not using an action plan, but that you have an IEP that has a section dedicated to behavior, and so again, to work at that as a team, especially for tier 3 students, we shouldn't be putting together IEPs for all students anyway. It really should be a select few, and even more so for those that have behavior goals. I invite you to go and take a look at the website. I will take a second to just do the run with you and show you different things. But I wanted to show you that there are editorials that are specific to frustration and aggression. Here's the Inside Out activity that I was mentioning that Hannah Beach had prepared. And this is her book. There's a chapter that is dedicated to aggression, reclaiming our students. For those that are more familiar with Rest, Play, Grow, there is a chapter called Tears and Tantrums that addresses frustration and aggression as well. And so these are great resources. If you're working with a colleague who hasn't taken my webinar or a parent who wants to know more, these articles can be an easy share in terms of making sense of this phenomenon. So I'm just going to stop the slides for a second, and I'm going to stop sharing because I want to put the website. Here we go. So in terms of the website, the address is, I'll put it here, it's cbm.ca. So I'll put in the chat for those who don't know the website. It is www.cebm.ca. So that's the main website. And once you get into the website, for those that work with K4, K5, I do have on the main website underneath practices a K4, K5 corner. I am currently working on revamping this page. I've got a few different webinars. I am working with a group right now on creating a pyramid of intervention for K4, K5. It is still just a draft right now. But this is to come, soon, probably in the early 2024. We've got different infographics, different editorials and so forth. So this is for K4, K5. If we go to the resource center and you go underneath challenges, you will find the third button is frustration and aggression. So here you will find the placemat. You will find it in English and in French. And then this is a webinar that I did last year, and similar to the one that I'm doing right now for you. And then that's the one I did this morning for the adolescents, for those who may be interested. It's a very similar presentation, but that's the one for teens that is available here. Here is the document on the games and activities that you could be doing for frustration and aggression. This is the action plan that I showed in the document. In this document, they go together. And then you've got different editorials that you can share with colleagues or with parents. The Inside Out activity is right here. And did I put the other activity? Let me just see. No, I didn't. I'm sorry about that. Oh, I forgot to mention on the main website, underneath projects, you've got the emotions room that is there. So if you want to know more about the emotions room and how to use it, I invite you to go and take a look at this page. So in terms of other materials, I mentioned emotion materials. So if you go underneath materials, the first button is emotion intervention materials. You will find here further down. So here are the emotional release activities. Those are the other two that Hannah Beach created. You've got the personal choice board. You've got the K cycle 1 emotions folder, and you've got the squawk box for elementary and the squawk box for high school. So these are the emotion intervention materials. Then I've got things on brain breaks if you're interested, on movement stations. I've got here under cocoon area, this is a designated area for the classroom. So you've got a document here that's there. What else do I have that might be relevant? I mean, I really invite you to go. Oh, I even have, in terms of children's literature, some of our favorite books and activities to go with it. So we've got one, for example, on Maya, who's grumpy. We've got, some on feelings, on and so forth. So I invite you to go and take a look at that. So that's there. So I'm going to stop sharing now. Emmanuel, should I keep the recording for the questions, or should I just stop the recording?
I think we can stop the recording just so people maybe feel more comfortable.